Bonjour et bienvenue from Chamonix. My name is Professor Nick Draper. I'm the chair of the International Rock Climbing Research Association, and whilst I can't join you in person today, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our 2018 Congress. C'est mon grand plaisir. Bienvenue au 4e Congrès de ICRA ici à Chamonix en France. Merci beaucoup d'être ici avec nous pour partager vos connaissances et votre expérience avec l'ASCALD. Je tiens personnellement à remercier Pierre, Ludo et l'équipe pour tout le travail accompli pour organiser ce qui promet d'être un merveilleux 5 jours ensemble. I wanted to start my opening address by talking to you about the history and the origins of the International Rock Climbing Research Association. The association was formed after a first congress which was held in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2011. Prior to that, a group of us had talked around the idea of trying to bring together researchers and those interested in rock climbing and trying to bring them together for an exchange of ideas and knowledge, and also something that was a little bit different in terms of having some practical activities associated with the Congress as well, and having a conference instead of about a scientific discipline was one about a sport and looking at the research across disciplines. So we started that organisation around 2009, and 2 years later we held our first Congress, and we were indebted to the interested climbers and researchers that came across to that Congress, including one participant who flew all the way from Spain and arrived, presented and flew home 4 hours later. But it was a fantastic Congress and worked really well, and during that Congress, a group of us met, and I'm indebted to Tino and Andy and Hans-Peter Bircher, who sat together in a room over a beer and thought about how we could continue this work and also how we could create a network. And from that, the International Rock Climbing Research Association was born. And then we agreed to meet again in Switzerland. And this we did in 2014, which was followed by a later Congress organised by Phil Watts and his great team in the year of Phil's retirement, which was a great event and really enjoyable in Telluride, Colorado. And from that, we then organised the current Congress, which you're sitting at today here in Chamonix, France. We're absolutely delighted to host our 4th Congress here in Chamonix. It's a wonderful host venue, being situated in the shadows of Mont Blanc and providing excellent opportunities for hiking, mountaineering, trad climbing, sport climbing and bouldering. It will provide all delegates with wonderful distractions outside the Congress, and I hope your stay in Congress experience will leave you longing for your next ICRA event, which will be our 5th Congress, which is to be hosted either in Tokyo or in Cadiz in 2020. Please enjoy the wonderful event here in Chamonix, and I look forward to joining you at the 2020 Congress or before if you're visiting New Zealand in the intervening period. Wonderful to be able to welcome you to this 4th Congress, and an exciting time for the sport of rock climbing as we see it included in the programme for the Olympic Games for the first time in a fantastically unusual and exciting format with a sort of rock climbing triathlon. And we look forward to our days together, but also we look forward to that event in 2020 and some of the preparations that the teams will be looking at in order to prepare athletes to compete in Tokyo. Rock climbing is a wonderful sport and provides fantastic diversity. We can see that through the opportunities to take part in different disciplines, through mountaineering, bouldering, sport climbing, scrambling, competition climbing, etc. Also over the different terrain through slabs and overhangs, short problems in bouldering, or long mountaineering routes and so on. And then we can look at different locations, different venues around the world, the picturesque settings that we climb in quite often, and those wonderful differences in rock types. We also, through experience with working with climbers and being climbers ourselves, we know that the motivations for climbers differ greatly as well. And that offers wonderful opportunities for research. So we know that some people climb purely for recreation and being out in the outdoors. We know there are elite climbers and many climbers that climb in order to improve their grade and their ability. And we know there are competition climbers who work sometimes entirely or the majority of their work around the competition circuit and training to improve their performance that way. And we know in recent years, in terms of climbing, that we've seen an increase in popularity of the sport, which is undoubtedly in part due to the availability of climbing now with the advent of climbing walls and the indoor facilities that they offer and the all year round climbing they present. Climbing is not only a sport, it allows us a great opportunity as researchers to investigate the activity. We see in it some commonalities though, and often we see with climbers a wish and a desire to improve performance. And whether it's pushing grades or it's around decreasing fatigue or coping with different environmental conditions or looking at nutritional strategies, climbers are interested in the sport they take part in. And often, and I think this is one of the fantastic things, they have very honest, frank conversations about their ability and about how to improve their performance. When we look back at the origins of climbing research, we know that the last few decades have seen a dramatic increase in the number of papers published. But we can look back to perhaps the early or mid to late 70s for the sort of first areas of research. And interestingly, as an exercise physiologist, one of the sort of first papers that was published was that by Williams et al., where they concluded that climbing was more about moral fibre than muscle fibre. And they saw the psychological aspects of climbing being far more important than physiological. And we know later that Watts, in 2004, published a paper where he highlighted that actually the physical aspects are vitally important to climbers as well, and we must take cognizance of those when we think about changing performance. Given that I have a captive audience for this short time, I wanted to then really just talk about the research that our research groups have been involved in over the last sort of 20 years or so. We know that the origins of research began in the field around the 1970s, but what we noticed around 20 years ago when we came into this research area, there were some issues that were important to investigate in order to improve the quality of the research that we could do. So one of the things was really clear was that we didn't have many sport-specific measures that had been tested for validity and reliability, and so we set about looking at some of those in our early research. We're also very aware that there was a lack of consistency in reporting between studies from different groups around the world. And then as a climber myself, one of the things I've always been interested in is the interaction between the physical and the psychological and how that can affect performance. And so that's the other area that our research groups have looked at. If we look at improving sport-specific measures, we've produced papers that relate to performance assessment tools, to measuring flexibility, and also in terms of measuring power, in terms of the power slap test that we developed. All of those, I think, have made a contribution to the development of sport-specific measures, and the recent multi-centre trial that we completed with a number of centres and researchers who are in the room today provides evidence of that development of that work and highlights, I think, also with those measures, the importance of having sport-specific measures for assessing the performance of climbers. The second strand of research that arose to us was the lack of consistency in reporting. So one of the first papers we published was in 2011, and in that one we looked at and tried to verify self-report climbing grades. It was clear that a number of studies were reporting the ability of climbers, but that hadn't been validated in a sense, well, how do we know that climbers accurately report their climbing ability? So we set about designing a study in order to investigate that, and we're really pleased in terms of the results because I think it helps the whole field when we found that actually there was a really good correlation between the grades that climbers report and their actual climbing ability. And we know that's the case both for male and female climbers. The other work we've done was also through the International Rock Climbing Research Association congresses, where we set about looking at climbing grades and trying to unify some of the terminology. In some papers, we see climbers of a particular grade being reported as recreational, where in another paper we'd see them recorded as elite climbers. So through consultation and working with experts across the world, we designed and developed a grading comparison scale. And with that, we've hoped to try and bring some clarity and some consistency in terms of the terminology we use for different grades of climbers. And whilst we recognise that a 5B UK doesn't always equal a 6A French, it does help us as a general guide for assessing the grade of and ability of climbers, and therefore being able to compare between studies. The third area that I was wanting to sort of talk about today, and I guess is kind of the main part I'll talk about, is that around psychophysiology in climbing. And we can see from the diagram from Horst from 2010 that that area obviously sees that interaction between the mental and the physical, or we might call it, more correctly perhaps, the emotional and behavioural and the physical. In Goddard and Newman's terminology, they talked about that interaction between, or I would talk about the interaction between their physical fitness and the psychological aspects. My interest in climbing and my interest, I guess, in terms of anxiety in climbing arose when I was in my mid-teens and some of my early climbing experiences, but then also as I've climbed later on. So little examples or anecdotes of things that I found interesting in terms of climbing was when I first went on a climbing trip with my PE teachers. I went down to the southwest coast of the UK, Dorset, and to the area of Swanage, if anybody's climbed there. And we had a fantastic weekend climbing away with our PE teachers. And if you think about health and safety and modern standards and things like that, it didn't meet any of those, but was a wonderful experience. We were down climbing on Dancing Ledge without any ropes or being tied on in any way, and just climbed kind of after a little bit of instruction and away we went. But fantastic experience, and we all survived that experience. But one of the sort of lasting memories was when we were walking along the cliff edge, and there was a 6-inch path, and as I was walking along it, I saw an adder, which is the only poisonous snake in the UK, and I was totally gripped in that moment because I didn't know whether to be more scared and react to the snake or react to the fact that I was just on the edge of a 60-foot drop. And so that kind of dual stress and that whole thing of anxiety and its effect on you kind of really hit home from that moment. It's always stuck in my mind. And then a second experience was when I was climbing with my wife in North Wales. We were on a 2-pitch route in Tremaddock, which is a lovely little crag by the coast. Often when it's raining in the mountains in Wales, you can climb at Tremaddock and there's a bit of dry areas to be able to get up routes. And we were climbing a 2-pitch route. I was leading the second pitch. And as my wife looked across onto the pitch of the sort of stance for another climb, there was a climber who led up the first pitch, and just the whole anxiety of the climb and being on the lead and everything like that had got to him, and he had to go to the toilet there and then. So being environmentally friendly, he got himself a little plastic bag, went into that, only 5-10 meters away from where we were climbing, went into the plastic bag, tied it up and put it onto the back of his rucksack, and then continued to climb up the climb. That hit to me in a number of ways in terms of the sort of the effect of that. Just amazing how gripped you can become in a climb and how anxiety can take effect on you, but also just in terms of the descent as we went down the belay route. They borrowed our ropes to descend because we'd set up an abseil to go down, and as he went down the descent of that, you could just see the little baggie swinging backwards and forwards as he went abseil down, and I was just praying that the bag didn't burst on the way down. Those kinds of experiences, and lots of experiences in terms of climbing and being above a piece of gear and how you change your climbing when you are above gear, particularly on trad routes, in comparison to when you're climbing below the gear. Those kinds of experiences really gave me an interest in anxiety and its effect on performance, particularly in adventure sports, but specifically in climbing. And it centers around this whole idea of fear of falling, and whether there are higher level climbers, and this anecdotal thing we hear about higher level climbers being able to have a no fall mindset. I also was really interested in whether this, is there a certain point at which climbers change with this no fall mindset? Does it appear above a particular grade or ability level? And that's what sets those climbers to lock down anxiety down. That sets them apart from other climbers. In terms of looking at anxiety, we go back and we've always gone back to the idea of stress as sort of spoken about by Hans Selye, and that defined as that non-specific response of the body to a demand. So we look at that and we know that stress is a threat to homeostasis, and we know therefore the sort of fear of falling is a stress. There's an anxiety created to that, and that invokes this fight or flight response, which can affect performance. When we look at that and we look at the stress response, we can see that when there's a stress, there's a threat to homeostasis. That causes an altering in bodily functioning, and if we're exercising, that adds to the physiological load. If we can remove that stress, then the body returns to homeostasis. And we know that that fight or flight response is affected by the sympathetic adrenomedullary system and also the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis. And that gives rise to a number of key hormones that we're interested in terms of psychophysiology research, those being adrenaline, noradrenaline, and really specifically for climbing, cortisol, which has been widely studied in a number of research projects. And we can see those on the diagram in terms of their link to the adrenal gland and the production of those key hormones within the adrenal gland. When we look at, I speak as an exercise physiologist, and so I had to read around the work around psychology. We know that psychology has a long history, and sports psychology links back to some of the early work in terms of psychology, and we can look to something like the inverted U hypothesis, which any good exercise physiologist will tell you is actually an N rather than an inverted U, but psychologists being psychologists, they've called an N an inverted U. However, that discrepancy apart, what we can see in terms of arousal is that we see this peak point of arousal where we need to have a good level of arousal to perform well, but once we go beyond that peak, we see decrements in performance. And our interpretation of that is that that's when we see anxiety and fear taking their effect on performance and having a negative effect. This video, I think, highlights anxiety really well, and in some ways maybe nobody does stress better than the Americans.
Chuck left hand, yeah, clip from there. Come on, Liz.
You can
Come
do
on,
it.
Liz, just breathe and relax. I got you, Liz, come on.
Come on, Liz. You can do
I
it.
can't do it, Raj.
I got you, come on, just get a clip. Come on, Liz.
Whipper!
So we see stress from that video, you see stress in action. And the voice of the climber is fantastic in terms of expressing that anxiety we can see when we're quite a way above our last piece of gear. However, there are climbers like Dan Osman who appear to be able to dispense with anxiety, with that anxiety and fear, and are able to perform at high levels and skilled performance, but in really high risk situations. But moving on from there, Alex Honnold, 20 years later, not only decided to repeat the climb in fancy dress, also did it 10 seconds quicker and finished with a rock band.
In the classic 1997 film, Masters of Stone 4, Dan Osmond entertained climbers from all over the world when he raced up the route Bears Reach in only 4 minutes and 25 seconds. I probably watched that video 100 times. 20 years later, I figured I'd give it a go.
And the interesting quote from Alex Honnold is around his particular gifts. He doesn't see himself as an exceptional climber, but where he thinks he does have a gift is in that ability, it's a mental one, and his ability to lock down anxiety where others might feel the fear. And this was the aspect that we were fascinated by as a research team when we began our research in the late 90s to early 2000s. So we wanted to see whether we could find evidence of a no-fall mindset, and could higher ability climbers lock down anxiety and fear. We set about this doing this through a number of studies, and in those, climbing, as I said, has a great options for manipulating the climbing environment. So we can look at route knowledge on-site versus red point climbs. We can look at the safety protocol in terms of lead, top ropes, or lead run out. We can look at the difficulty of the climbs in terms of the length, the angle, the wall, and the frequency of holds, and so on. All of those things allowed us to complete a number of studies where we manipulated those variables in order to see their effect on the climbers. We did this with a variety of level climbers, but primarily with intermediate climbers because of their availability. The measures we used were divided into psychological and physiological, and we can see those from the slide. And they were classic ones that anybody who's read our papers would have seen on a number of occasions. We also see that there were others that were during this time that were interested in this research area and used similar measures. But when we look at the results of those studies, we start to see some problems with the measurements. So if we look at somatic anxiety, whilst we'd hope we'd see changes in a certain direction with the types of studies we ran, we see an inconsistent response and differences. If we look at cognitive anxiety, we see a similar picture, and with self-confidence, and possibly we see a little bit more of a pattern in terms of a negative effect as more stressful situation causing a negative effect on self-confidence, and possibly that's stronger across the studies than it is for cognitive or somatic anxiety. But with cortisol, we see directional, we see highlighted, I guess, in that the most consistent result when you look at it on that figure, which shows that there's an increase in cortisol response in more stressful situations. However, because of the biological diurnal variation in cortisol measurements, we very rarely see significant differences in those studies. Pre-climb anxiety, again, was a little bit more consistent, so there was an increase in anticipatory heart rate, pre-climb in more stressful situations, and we did generally find significance in those types of studies. But we were still left with a problem. Through the research we did and the papers we put together, we came to the conclusion either there is no identifiable point at which mindset changes, or alternatively, our markers had too much noise in them in order to be sensitive enough to detect differences between climbers. So in 2013-14, when Dave Giles started his PhD, he and I sat together over many a coffee in the local cafe at our university and talked through expanding the research and looking at new ways to go and investigate these problems. We looked at a number of things. So we looked at changing the number of participants, we looked at the types of measures we were using, and also some of those research contexts. The first thing we did in terms of a piece of research was to try and see if we can find a difference in some key markers between climbers and non-climbers. And this was done with about 30 participants, rock climbers versus controls, and used a climbing neutral task, which was to use a 20-meter wire ladder, which the participants climbed, and we measured a number of markers and looked at their response. When we used this climbing neutral task, we found there was a difference. So we found that climbers and non-climbers had different responses physiologically to the stress of working at height. And therefore, we concluded, in terms of the research, we concluded one of two things is occurring. Either climbers self-select to the sport because of a predisposition to working at height, or alternatively, they habituate to the height and therefore have a blunted psychophysiological response. After we taken this sort of foundational study, almost taken a step back from where we started our research some years before, after we did that, we then looked at and developed a range of different measures to see if we could find significant differences with more sensitive tools. And we tried those out, and you can see those across the slide. And we picked up on some of the work from other researchers, and also used expert climbers to help devise some of those. So we see geometric entropy we used in some of the studies, along with a coach performance assessment tool which Nicola Taylor and Dave Giles developed in order to look at and assess performance from a coach's perspective. And then we used some work that had models that had been used. So for example, the challenge and threat theory, which had been used particularly in a golf setting, but had used in sports psychology studies to look at how people interpret a stress situation, and then also the AGQ and the immediate anxiety measurement scale. And these we employed across a number of studies. Repeating and moving on from some of the earlier studies we did, we took a larger sample of climbers, intermediate climbers, 34 of them, and we looked at 3 different conditions and had lead top rope and a lead run out, where they had a sort of a longer step to the last clip at the top of the climb, and we looked at that effect on performance. And when we did that, it showed again, and I kind of reinforced with a bigger group, that yes, lead climbing does present a more stressful measure, a more stressful situation. However, the other finding that I think was really important was something that occurred when you try and compare psychological measures, which require a number response. When you try and do those between groups, you very seldom find a difference. But when you use them as a repeated measure, you get much more sensitivity in their use, and that was something we then tried to do in subsequent studies, and it was highlighted in this study that it works much better when people have repeats on using the same measure. A further study that Dave Giles completed as part of his PhD studies, which is one of a number of studies which are in development for publication, was one that had 61 participants who were divided into one of 3 groups, as you can see from the slide. They climbed close to their limit, either slightly above, at their limit, or below their lead limit. From that, we then measured a number of psychological, physiological markers, which you can also see in the slide. And when we look at that, we saw significant differences in quality of movement with increased difficulty of climb, and similarly, significant mental stress by changes in somatic and cognitive anxiety, whilst again, cortisol concentrations, there was no significant difference, again, possibly related to the biological variation. So what was interesting in terms of conclusions from this study was that not only is there an increase in the physical demands associated with an increase in grade, but we also see a change in the psychological demand. And the final study I'll mention this afternoon is possibly one of the biggest qualitative studies where Dave was responsible for interviewing 61 climbers about their experiences with climbing. And this study arose because Dave and I had talked for a long time about whether we could identify this no-fall mindset. And we literally, over a decade of research on the area, tried a wide range of physiological and psychological markers, but we're still no closer to identifying this no-fall mindset. So we said, well, or I said to Dave one day when we were sitting, I said, probably the only thing we can do now is to interview them. If we can't find the question through the markers, then we need to talk to the climbers and see if we can find out information that way. And Dave set about designing a really nice study and interview schedule in order to ascertain the views of climbers. And in the next couple of slides, you can see some of the comments. Now, in reading those and in hearing those as Dave collected his data, I found it fascinating that intermediate and advanced level climbers were expressing these feelings about falling. If this had been a novice group, they were the kinds of comments I would have expected. But given these are experienced climbers, it's really quite stark to see A, how climbers feel, and B, how they kind of avoid that situation, and incidental things like the importance of the belayer. And perhaps studies haven't necessarily thought about that as a key part of the psychological component for a climber. But the really fascinating thing that arose from the research was the comment from this advanced level climber, which was echoed from other climbers as well. And what we saw with that, where we saw the intermediate climbers expressing their fear and anxiety associated with climbing close to their limit or at their limit, with the advanced level climbers, the language changed and they talked about trying to make one more move or the next move. And that, I think, is where Dave and I, in terms of the research, feel that there is a difference. So perhaps in that level between intermediate and advanced level climbers, there is something that changes in terms of the mindset, and something I think that requires further research to see if it can be verified with other climbing groups. When we look at the conclusions from that study, I think the comments of Sager and Horst are really relevant. And it's not necessarily the falling, but it's almost the fear of falling that is or the fear of what the fall will be like and not knowing what the fall will be like, which is the real stressor. It may be, therefore, that somewhere around intermediate to advanced level, we do see a change in mindset. What I think was wonderful about the research was just, again, and I've mentioned it at the start of the presentation, was the honesty and frankness of the comments from the climbers. They really spoke honestly, and it's a credit to Dave's research that he was able to elicit such open and honest responses from the climbers. In conclusion to my little opening address, then I just wanted to, I guess, highlight where we've got to with our research, and that is that we do appear to be able to distinguish between climbers and non-climbers now, and there does appear somewhere between intermediate and advanced level to be some sort of locking down of that fear and anxiety in order to focus more on performance than worries about safety during the climb. The research, again, I think the research that we did with Dave supports the fact that an on-site climb is more stressful, more challenging, not surprisingly, and will affect performance. That has implications for elite climbers as much as it does for intermediate climbers, perhaps. Also, we need to be aware that when we increase the grade of the climb, not only do we increase the physiological component, we also increase the psychological component as well. I think with the research that David's collected, we now have a wider range of markers with which to investigate the psychophysiological effects on climbers. And that has implications, I think, in terms of the research generally has implication for climber development, moving through the grades, but also potentially in improving performance for elite athletes. And I think this is an area where further research is required. Dave also completed a study, and I haven't reported it here because of time. Dave also did a pilot study, really in effect, around fall training, and showed that fall training does help to improve a number of sort of markers around anxiety and also success on routes. But it may need to be tailored or individualized in order to best suit each climber. I've mentioned already about the honesty and frankness of climbers, and I think it's a wonderful group of athletes to work with. So, future research. I can see that there's a need for research around further examination of the markers. I think qualitative research with higher grade climbers would be fascinating, and looking at investigating fall training and techniques and improvements to help increase performance and reduce anxiety would be wonderful. We'd be delighted to talk to any PhD students who would like to, or any climbers and researchers that would be interested to continue PhD research with our research group. And I guess in terms of those sort of final comments, it's shown to me that I think it's very difficult to answer the questions that are important to climbing whilst remaining within one discipline. As an exercise physiologist, a lot of the answers to the things I'm interested in lay in the area of psychology as well. And similarly, you can't take one research approach. It's not as helpful to think of yourself just as a qualitative or a quantitative researcher. My strongest advice is follow the research method that best answers the question. And lastly, just in comments around the research, I just want to acknowledge the great researchers that I've worked with in recent years and their fantastic work, some of which I've touched on today. I'd like to thank you for your time. Now, I had a captive audience and it was wonderful to be able to speak to you about some of the research we've done. Have a wonderful and productive Congress. I'm really sorry I can't be with you, but knee surgery waits for no man. And so tomorrow I shall go under the knife and hopefully all is well afterwards. And I look forward to hearing about the Congress as I recover. I hope to see you all in 2020, if not before. I'm really happy to look at research collaborations and talk with people about this after the Congress, and I hope you have a fantastic experience during the Congress. And I'll leave you just with a little video that reminds all of us that climbing is a natural instinct for all of us, and even at a young age you can climb with good ethics, i.e. not using knees at the finish.